In March 1943, a classified memo reached the desk of Captain Harold Voss at the Army Ordnance Proving Grounds in Aberdeen, Maryland. The order was simple, brutal, and seemingly impossible. Extend the operational range of the M4 Sherman tank from 120 miles to over 400 miles without external refueling. The North African campaign demanded it. The Wehrmacht was retreating across vast stretches of Libyan desert, and American armor could not keep pace. Supply convoys were being decimated by Luftwaffe raids, and every gallon of fuel lost meant another mile the Shermans could not travel. The memo gave Voss 6 weeks to solve a problem that had stumped engineers for 2 years. Harold Voss was not a typical military engineer. Before the war, he had been a mechanic in rural Pennsylvania, known locally for modifying tractor engines to run on kerosene, wood gas, and once, experimentally, on rendered animal fat. His superiors considered him eccentric, his subordinates called him reckless, but when the impossible order arrived, Voss did not protest. He simply locked himself in the engine testing bay with a single M4 Sherman, a toolbox, and a notebook filled with diagrams that no one else could decipher. The M4 Sherman was powered by a Continental R975 radial engine, a reliable but thirsty 9-cylinder beast that consumed gasoline at a rate of roughly 1 gallon per mile under combat conditions. The tank carried 175 gallons of fuel in its internal tanks, which gave it a theoretical range of 120 miles on roads and far less across sand. Extending that range meant either adding more fuel tanks, which would make the vehicle dangerously top-heavy and flammable, or fundamentally altering how the engine consumed fuel. The first option was unacceptable. The second was considered theoretically impossible by every engineer who had examined the problem. Voss began by stripping the engine down to its crankshaft. He spent 3 days measuring fuel flow rates, combustion chamber temperatures, and exhaust gas compositions. He noticed something that others had dismissed as irrelevant. The R975 engine was wasting nearly 30% of its fuel through incomplete combustion at low throttle settings. The fuel-air mixture was too rich, flooding the cylinders with unburned gasoline that simply vaporized into the exhaust. It was an engineering flaw embedded in the original design, intended to provide maximum power during short bursts of acceleration. But in the desert, where tanks traveled at steady cruising speeds for hours, it was hemorrhaging fuel. Voss proposed a solution that his commanding officer immediately rejected as insane. He wanted to install a secondary carburetor system that would lean out the fuel mixture during cruising, reducing fuel flow by nearly 40% while maintaining engine temperature within safe limits. The risk was catastrophic engine failure. If the mixture became too lean, the cylinders would overheat, the pistons would seize, and the entire engine block would fracture. A single miscalculation would leave a crew stranded in the desert, vulnerable and immobile. But Voss was not asking for permission. He had already begun welding the prototype system into the test Sherman. By the time his superiors discovered what he was doing, the modifications were irreversible. The only option left was to test it. On April 12, 1943, the modified Sherman was driven onto the Aberdeen Proving Grounds for a controlled endurance trial. Voss sat in the driver's seat, refusing to let anyone else take the risk. The engine roared to life, and the tank began to move. For the first hour, everything functioned normally. Then Voss engaged the secondary carburetor system. The engine's roar dropped to a low, steady rumble. Fuel consumption fell immediately, but so did the engine temperature gauge, dropping into a range that should have caused stalling. The tank did not stall, it kept moving. By the end of the 8-hour test, the Sherman had traveled 310 miles on a single tank of fuel. It was the longest, uninterrupted range ever recorded for an American medium tank. Voss climbed out of the driver's hatch, covered in grease and diesel fumes, and handed his notebook to the commanding officer without saying a word. Inside were the schematics for what would later be classified as Modification Order 743, the Voss Fuel Extension System. 3 weeks later, the system was installed in 12 M4 Shermans and shipped to the 1st Armored Division in Tunisia. The crews were not told what had been changed. They were simply ordered to push deeper into the desert than any American tank had gone before. And they did. The Shermans crossed 400 miles of open desert without resupply, arriving behind German lines just as Rommel's forces were evacuating toward Sicily. The surprise was total. The breakthrough was decisive. But Harold Voss never saw the results of his work. On May 3, 1943, he was killed in an unrelated engine test accident at Aberdeen. A fuel line ruptured during a high-pressure trial, igniting the testing bay in seconds. He was 34 years old. His modification was declassified in 1958, 15 years after his death, and quietly attributed to collaborative engineering efforts. His name appeared nowhere in the official reports. The war moved on, the Shermans kept rolling, and somewhere in the Libyan desert, rusted fuel lines still carry the ghost of a modification that should never have worked. Harold Voss was born in 1909 in a town so small it no longer appears on most maps. His father was a coal miner, his mother a seamstress. There was no money for college, no family tradition of engineering. But Voss had a talent that could not be taught. He understood machines the way other men understood language. By the age of 16, he could disassemble a tractor engine, identify a failing valve by sound alone, and reassemble the entire mechanism without consulting a manual. He did not read about combustion theory. He simply knew it. In 1928, Voss opened a repair shop in rural Pennsylvania. Farmers brought him equipment that other mechanics had declared unsalvageable. Voss would work through the night, alone, refusing help, and by morning the machine would run again. He rarely explained how. When asked, he would shrug and say that the engine had told him what was wrong. People thought he was joking. He was not. Voss's reputation spread slowly, quietly, through word of mouth among men who worked with their hands. He became known as the mechanic who could make anything run on anything. During the Great Depression, when fuel was expensive and farmers were desperate, Voss began experimenting with alternative combustion methods. He modified engines to run on kerosene, which was cheaper than gasoline. Then wood gas, generated by burning scrap lumber in a homemade gasifier. Once, as a test, he converted a harvester engine to run on rendered pig fat. It worked. It smelled terrible, but it worked. In 1941, after Pearl Harbor, Voss enlisted in the Army Corps of Engineers. He was 32 years old. Too old for infantry, too uneducated for officer training. He was assigned to the Aberdeen Proving Ground as a civilian contractor, with the rank of technical specialist. His job was to assist in vehicle maintenance. His actual role was to solve problems that no one else could solve. The Army did not know what to do with him. Voss refused to follow standard procedures. He ignored safety protocols. He modified equipment without authorization and submitted reports written in shorthand that only he could read. His commanding officers considered him insubordinate. His fellow engineers considered him dangerous. But when a tank broke down in a way that defied diagnosis, they sent for Voss, and Voss fixed it. In early 1943, the fuel range problem became critical. The North African campaign was stalling not because of enemy firepower, but because of logistics. American tanks could not travel far enough between supply depots. The Germans, using captured fuel and more efficient engines, were outmaneuvering the Allies across open desert. The War Department issued urgent requests for solutions. Engineers proposed dozens of modifications: larger fuel tanks, auxiliary trailers, experimental diesel conversions. All were rejected as impractical or too slow to implement. Voss read the classified reports in silence. Then he requested access to a single M4 Sherman and 3 weeks of uninterrupted testing time. His request was denied. He proceeded anyway. Late at night, after the proving grounds had emptied, Voss would enter the vehicle testing bay and work alone. He brought no assistance, filed no progress reports, and ignored repeated orders to stop. He was risking court-martial. He did not care. He had found something in the engine that no one else had noticed, a flaw so fundamental that it had been built into every R975 radial engine ever manufactured. The Continental R975 was designed for aircraft use, where engines operated at high throttle settings for sustained periods. When adapted for tanks, the fuel delivery system was never recalibrated for low-speed cruising. The carburetor fed the engine as if it were preparing for takeoff, flooding the cylinders with excess gasoline that burned incompletely and vaporized into waste. It was an invisible hemorrhage, costing the Army thousands of gallons of fuel every day across every theater of war. Voss's solution was elegant and terrifying. He would install a secondary fuel regulation system that reduced gasoline flow during steady cruising, leaning the fuel-air mixture to the edge of operational safety. The modification required precision machining, custom valves, and a level of risk that violated every engineering standard in the manual. If the mixture became too lean, the engine would overheat and destroy itself within minutes. If it became unstable, the tank would stall in combat. There was no margin for error. Voss built the prototype by hand, working from sketches he carried in a notebook that never left his possession. He fabricated components in the machine shop after hours, using scrap metal and repurposed parts. When questioned, he claimed he was repairing damaged equipment. No one checked. By the time his superiors discovered what he was building, the modification was already installed in the test Sherman. On the morning of the endurance trial, Voss's commanding officer ordered him to remove the system immediately. Voss refused. He climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and drove the Sherman out onto the proving grounds. The test would proceed whether or not he had authorization. If the modification failed, he would accept the consequences. If it succeeded, the Army would have no choice but to adopt it. The engine did not fail. It ran for 8 hours straight, covering 310 miles on fuel that should have been exhausted after 120. Voss returned to the testing bay, shut down the engine, and handed his notebook to the officer who had ordered him to stop. Inside were the complete schematics for the system, drawn with the precision of a man who had spent 3 weeks thinking of nothing else. 3 days later, Voss received orders to prepare the modification for mass production. 12 tanks would be converted immediately and shipped to North Africa for field testing. If the system performed in combat, it would be installed across the entire M4 fleet. Voss was told that his work might change the course of the war. He never responded. He simply returned to the testing bay and began preparing for the next trial. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time you are listening to this story. We are interested in knowing to what places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The Libyan desert in 1943 was not a battlefield. It was a graveyard that happened to host a war. Temperatures reached 130 degrees Fahrenheit during the day and dropped to near freezing at night. Sand infiltrated every mechanical system, clogging air filters, grinding down gearboxes, and turning engine oil into abrasive paste. Water was more valuable than ammunition. Fuel was more precious than both. The Afrika Korps had learned to survive in this environment through brutal adaptation. German tanks carried extra fuel in external drums welded to their hulls, a dangerous modification that turned every vehicle into a potential fireball, but extended their range by nearly 200 miles. Their supply lines were shorter, their logistics more efficient, and their commanders more willing to abandon damaged vehicles rather than waste fuel on recovery. Rommel's forces moved like a mirage across the desert, appearing where they should not be, vanishing before Allied armor could respond. American forces, by contrast, were drowning in their own supply chains. The M4 Sherman was a magnificent machine in theory. Reliable, well-armored and mechanically sound, but it was designed for the roads of Europe, not the endless sand of North Africa. Its operational range of 120 miles meant that every advance required a supply convoy to follow within hours. Those convoys were slow, vulnerable, and easy targets for Luftwaffe bombers. For every Sherman that reached the front line, 3 more sat idle, waiting for fuel that might never arrive. In April 1943, the 1st Armored Division received 12 modified Shermans with no explanation. The tanks looked identical to standard models. The only difference was a small metal plate welded inside the engine compartment, stamped with the code MO743. Nuck. The crews were told nothing about what the modification did or why it had been installed. They were simply ordered to treat the tanks as experimental units and report any mechanical failures immediately. Lieutenant Samuel Corr commanded one of the modified Shermans. He was 23 years old, a farm boy from Iowa who had never seen a desert until the army shipped him to Africa. He did not trust experimental equipment. Every modification he had seen so far had either failed catastrophically or made the tank harder to operate. When his crew asked what MO743 meant, he told them it probably stood for Mechanical Disaster Model 7. The division's next objective was a German supply depot located 220 miles southeast of their current position, deep in territory that no American tank had reached before. Intelligence reported that the depot was lightly defended, but strategically critical. If it could be destroyed, Rommel's retreat toward Tunisia would become a rout, but the distance was impossible. No Sherman could travel 220 miles into the desert and return without refueling. The mission would require a supply convoy to accompany the tanks, which meant slow movement, high visibility, and inevitable air attacks. Then the orders changed. The 12 experimental Shermans would advance alone, without supply support, and attempt to reach the depot in a single, uninterrupted push. If they ran out of fuel, they were to abandon the vehicles and withdraw on foot. The mission was considered a probable loss. The crews were told to prepare for the worst. Corr read the orders in disbelief. Someone in command had lost their mind. Sending tanks 220 miles into the desert without refueling was not a mission. It was a death sentence. He filed a formal protest. It was denied. The attack would proceed at dawn. On the morning of April 28, 1943, 12 M4 Shermans rolled out of the Allied staging area and disappeared into the desert. The crews carried extra water, minimal ammunition, and no expectations of survival. They had been given coordinates, a compass bearing, and a radio frequency to report their position if they had to abandon the tanks. Most expected to be walking back within 24 hours. For the first 6 hours, the tanks moved normally. Fuel gauges dropped at the expected rate. Engine temperatures held steady. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, a flat expanse of sand and heat with no landmarks, no roads, and no shade. The only sound was the grinding of treads and the roar of engines laboring under the weight of armor and ammunition. Then, around midday, something changed. The fuel gauges stopped falling as quickly. Engine noise dropped to a lower pitch, steadier and less aggressive. The tanks were still moving at the same speed, still covering the same distance, but they were consuming less fuel. Corr checked his instruments 3 times, convinced they were malfunctioning. They were not. The Sherman was using 40% less gasoline than it should have been. By nightfall, the 12 tanks had traveled 180 miles. They should have been out of fuel hours ago. Instead, their tanks still held enough gasoline to continue. Corr radioed the other commanders. They reported the same phenomenon. No one understood what was happening. The modification, whatever it was working. At dawn on the second day, the tanks reached the German supply depot. It was undefended. The garrison had evacuated 2 days earlier, assuming no Allied armor could reach them. The Shermans destroyed the fuel stockpiles, the vehicle repair facilities, and the communications equipment. Then they turned around and drove back. They arrived at the Allied staging area 72 hours after departure, having traveled over 400 miles on a single load of fuel. Not a single tank had broken down. Not a single crew had been forced to abandon their vehicle. The mission, which had been expected to fail, had succeeded beyond all projections. Core climbed out of his Sherman, exhausted and sunburned, and demanded to know what had been done to his tank. The answer came in the form of a classified technical memo, stamped with Harold Voss's name and the notation, "Field test successful. Recommend immediate fleet-wide adoption." The modification had worked. The desert had not swallowed these machines. For the first time in the North African campaign, American armor had outrun the Wehrmacht. But the man who made it possible was already dead. Harold Voss died on May 3, 1943, in a testing bay explosion that should never have happened. The official report listed the cause as catastrophic fuel line rupture during high-pressure combustion trial. The unofficial version, whispered among the engineers who worked at Aberdeen, was darker and more complicated. Voss had been testing a modification that had already been rejected by Army Command. He had ignored direct orders to stop, and when the fuel line ruptured, he had been alone in the bay, working after hours, with no safety observers and no fire suppression team on standby. The explosion occurred at 11:47 p.m. The testing bay was a reinforced concrete structure designed to contain engine failures, but it was not designed to contain a fuel fire. When the pressurized gasoline ignited, the bay filled with flames in seconds. The heat was intense enough to melt steel. Voss was killed instantly, likely before he even understood what was happening. By the time the fire was extinguished, there was nothing left to recover except charred metal and ash. The Army convened a formal investigation. The findings were predictable. Voss had violated safety protocols, ignored direct orders, and worked without supervision. His death was ruled accidental but preventable. The investigation recommended stricter oversight of experimental testing and the immediate suspension of all unauthorized modifications. Voss's personal notebook, the one he carried with him at all times, was never recovered. It was assumed to have been destroyed in the fire. But there were inconsistencies in the official report that no one seemed willing to discuss. The fuel line that ruptured had been inspected 2 days earlier and certified as structurally sound. The test Voss was conducting was listed as routine maintenance evaluation, not a high-pressure combustion trial, and several engineers who worked in adjacent bays reported hearing raised voices coming from the testing area shortly before the explosion, suggesting that Voss may not have been alone. One engineer, a machinist named Raymond Poole, submitted a supplementary statement claiming that he had seen 2 officers entering the testing bay around 11:30 p.m. He could not identify them, but he remembered that they were carrying a folder marked with a red classification seal. Poole's statement was noted in the investigation file and then quietly removed. When he asked why, he was told that his memory was mistaken and that he should not discuss the incident further. Voss's commanding officer, Colonel Arthur Banning, attended the funeral but did not speak. Voss's family was informed that he had died in the line of duty and that his work had contributed to the war effort. They were not told what he had been working on. They were not given access to his personal effects, and they were not told that the modification he died testing had already been installed in combat vehicles and was performing successfully in North Africa. The Voss fuel extension system, as it was classified internally, went into mass production in June 1943. Over 400 M4 Shermans were modified within 8 weeks. The system was installed in tanks deployed across North Africa, Italy, and eventually France. It extended operational range, reduced fuel consumption, and allowed American armor to operate in terrain that had previously been inaccessible. The modification was considered one of the most significant logistical improvements of the war. But Voss's name did not appear in any official documentation. The system was attributed to collaborative engineering efforts by the Army Ordnance Department. When technical manuals were published after the war, the modification was described in passive language. Fuel delivery optimization achieved through carburetor recalibration. No individual inventor was credited, no patent was filed. The modification simply existed as if it had emerged organically from the collective expertise of military engineers. In 1947, Voss's widow, Margaret, wrote to the War Department requesting information about her husband's work. She had heard rumors that he had invented something important, something that had saved lives. She wanted to know if it was true. The response she received was polite, vague, and final. Captain Voss contributed to various vehicle maintenance projects during his service. Specific details remain classified for security reasons. Margaret Voss died in 1981, never knowing that her husband's modification had been used in over 2,000 tanks, that it had extended the operational capability of American armor across 3 continents, and that it had been studied and reverse-engineered by Soviet and British military engineers after the war. She never knew that the system her husband invented in a locked testing bay, working alone and without authorization, had quietly altered the course of mechanized warfare. The modification remained in use until 1952, when the M4 Sherman was phased out in favor of more modern designs. By then, fuel injection systems had replaced carburetors, and Voss's elegant, dangerous solution was no longer needed. The last Sherman equipped with the Voss system was decommissioned in 1954 and sold for scrap. No effort was made to preserve it as a historical artifact. In 1958, the Army declassified portions of the technical documentation related to Modification Order 7-43. The declassified files included schematics, testing data, and field performance reports. They did not include Voss's name. The inventor was listed only as Technical Specialist, Aberdeen Proving Ground, designation TS-117. Researchers who later attempted to identify TS-117 found that personnel records for that designation had been lost in a fire at the National Archives in 1973. Harold Voss vanished from history the same way he died, alone, unwitnessed, and surrounded by flames that left nothing behind but questions. Lieutenant Samuel Corr survived the war. He returned to Iowa in 1945, married his high school sweetheart, and never spoke about the desert. When his children asked him what he had done during the war, he told them he had driven a tank. When they asked if he had seen combat, he said yes, but not the kind they imagined. The real enemy, he said, had not been the Germans. It had been the sand, the heat, and the fuel gauge. In 1963, Corr received a letter from a military historian researching the North African campaign. The historian had come across references to an experimental fuel modification tested in 1943 and wanted to interview veterans who had operated the modified Shermans. Corr agreed to meet. The interview took place in a diner in Des Moines and lasted 4 hours. Corr described the April 1943 mission in detail. The impossible orders, the 400-mile journey into the desert, the fuel gauges that defied logic. He remembered the moment when he realized the tank was consuming far less gasoline than it should have been. The disbelief among the crew and the growing certainty that someone, somewhere, had done something extraordinary to the engine. He remembered returning to base and demanding answers. He remembered being told that the modification was classified and that he was not to discuss it with anyone. The historian asked if Corr knew who had designed the system. Corr said he did not. He had been told only that it was the work of an engineer at Aberdeen who had died shortly after the field tests. The historian showed Corr a photograph of Harold Voss. Corr stared at it for a long time and then said, "I never met him, but I owe him my life." Kaur was not the only veteran who felt that way. In 1967, a reunion was held for survivors of the 1st Armored Division. Several men who had operated the experimental Shermans attended. They shared stories that had never been told publicly, missions deep into hostile territory, advances that should have been impossible, and battles won not through firepower, but through the simple ability to arrive when the enemy did not expect them. They spoke about the tanks that should not have returned but did, and about the engineer whose name they had never been told. One veteran, a former tank commander named Benjamin Cross, brought a piece of metal to the reunion. It was a fuel line valve, salvaged from a Sherman that had been decommissioned in 1951. Cross had kept it for 16 years, wrapped in cloth and stored in a drawer. He said it was the only physical proof he had that the modification had existed. He passed it around the table. Every man who touched it felt the same thing, gratitude mixed with anger, gratitude that the system had worked, anger that the man who invented it had been erased. In 1972, Cross wrote to the Department of Defense requesting that Harold Voss be posthumously recognized for his contribution to the war effort. The request was denied on the grounds that Voss's work had been part of a classified program and that individual recognition would compromise ongoing military research. Cross appealed. The appeal was denied. He tried contacting journalists, veterans organizations, and historical societies. None were interested. The story was too technical, too obscure, and too old. Cross died in 1989. In his will, he left the fuel line valve to the Smithsonian Institution with a note requesting that it be displayed alongside the names of engineers who had contributed to the war effort. The Smithsonian declined the donation, citing lack of provenance and unclear historical significance. The valve was returned to Cross's family. It was eventually lost during a house move. If this story has surprised you, leave a like to help the channel. By the 1990s, most of the veterans who had operated the modified Shermans were dead. The few who remained were in their 70s and 80s, their memories fading, their stories dismissed as anecdotal. The Voss fuel extension system existed only in declassified technical documents that no one read, in footnotes of obscure military histories, and in the fading recollections of men who had driven tanks across a desert that should have killed them. In 2003, a mechanical engineering professor at MIT came across a reference to Modification Order 7-43 while researching fuel efficiency improvements in military vehicles. He tracked down the declassified schematics and recognized immediately that the system was decades ahead of its time. The principle behind it, lean burn combustion control, would not be widely adopted in civilian vehicles until the 1980s. The professor published a paper analyzing the modification and noting that its inventor had never been identified. The paper was read by fewer than 200 people. One of them was Margaret Voss's granddaughter, a librarian in Pennsylvania who had grown up hearing vague stories about her grandfather's work during the war. She contacted the professor and provided him with family records, letters, and a single photograph of Harold Voss standing next to a Sherman tank at Aberdeen Proving Ground. The professor updated his paper to include Voss's name and submitted it to several historical journals. All rejected it. The story, they said, lacked sufficient documentation. In 2011, the professor died. His research files were donated to a university archive where they remain largely unexamined. The photograph of Harold Voss is stored in a filing cabinet labeled only as Unidentified Technician, circa 1943. The tanks that crossed 400 miles of desert without refueling have long since been scrapped. The fuel lines that carried Voss's modification have rusted into dust. The men who drove those tanks are gone, and the engineer who made it all possible exists now only as a designation in a declassified file, TAS-117, inventor unknown. The war ended in 1945, but the Voss fuel extension system did not. It lingered in the machinery of the post-war world, quietly embedded in vehicles that no one remembered had been modified. Surplus M4 Shermans were sold to Allied nations, donated to military museums, and repurposed as agricultural equipment in countries too poor to afford modern tractors. Many still carried the secondary carburetor system that Harold Voss had installed in 1943. Most operators never knew it was there. In 1948, the Israeli Defense Forces purchased a fleet of decommissioned Shermans from American military surplus. The tanks were old, outdated, and considered obsolete by modern standards, but they were cheap, and Israel needed armor. During the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, Israeli tank crews discovered that their Shermans could travel significantly farther than expected on limited fuel supplies. Mechanics examining the engines found the secondary carburetor system and assumed it was a factory standard feature. They did not know it was a battlefield modification invented by a dead engineer in a locked testing bay. The Israelis reverse-engineered the system and installed it in other vehicles. By 1950, variations of the Voss modification were being used in Israeli military trucks, armored cars, and even civilian buses operating in the Negev desert. The system was never patented. No one knew who had invented it. It simply worked, and that was enough. In 1953, a Soviet military engineer named Alexei Petrov was assigned to examine captured American equipment from the Korean War. Among the vehicles he studied was an M4 Sherman that had been abandoned by South Korean forces and recovered by Chinese troops. Petrov disassembled the engine and found the secondary fuel regulation system. He had never seen anything like it. The design was crude by Soviet standards, but the principle was brilliant: reduce fuel flow during steady operation without compromising engine stability. Petrov wrote a classified report recommending that similar systems be developed for Soviet armor. The report was filed and forgotten, but the idea survived. In 1957, Soviet engineers began experimenting with lean-burn carburetor systems for the T-54 tank. The modifications were based loosely on principles observed in captured American vehicles, though no direct credit was given to any specific source. The Soviet system was never as efficient as Voss's original design, but it extended the operational range of Soviet tanks by nearly 20%. It remained in use until the 1970s, when fuel injection systems made carburetors obsolete. In 1961, a British military attaché stationed in Egypt reported that Egyptian forces were using modified Shermans with unusually long operational ranges. British intelligence investigated and discovered that the tanks had been sold to Egypt by Israel, which had purchased them from American surplus in the 1940s. The British reverse-engineered the fuel system and incorporated elements of it into the Centurion tank. Once again, no inventor was credited. The modification was treated as an incremental improvement, a minor optimization that had emerged from the collective expertise of post-war military engineering. By 1965, variations of the Voss fuel extension system were being used in military vehicles across 6 continents. None of them knew they were using a design created by an American mechanic who had died in a testing bay fire 22 years earlier. The system had become part of the anonymous background technology of mechanized warfare, a small but persistent improvement that no one remembered inventing. In 1970, the last M4 Sherman in active military service was decommissioned by the Paraguayan army. The tank was donated to a military museum in Asunción, where it sat in a courtyard for 30 years, slowly rusting under the South American sun. In 2003, a team of restoration volunteers began refurbishing the Sherman for public display. When they opened the engine compartment, they found the secondary carburetor system still intact, its metal valve stamped with the code MO743. None of the volunteers knew what the code meant. They assumed it was a part number. The museum's curator contacted several military historians, asking if anyone could identify the modification. One historian, a specialist in World War II logistics, recognized the code and explained that it referred to a classified fuel efficiency system developed at Aberdeen Proving Ground in 1943. The curator asked who had invented it. The historian said the inventor's name had never been officially recorded. The Sherman remains on display in Asunción. A small plaque describes it as an American medium tank used in World War II and the Korean War. The plaque does not mention the fuel system. It does not mention Harold Voss. Visitors walk past it every day without knowing that the rusted valve inside the engine compartment represents one of the most significant mechanical innovations of the war. In 2015, a doctoral student at the University of Michigan wrote a dissertation on fuel efficiency improvements in military vehicles during World War II. She spent 2 years researching Modification Order 7-43, tracking its implementation across multiple theaters of war and documenting its influence on post-war vehicle design. She concluded that the system had extended the operational capability of American armor by an average of 35% and had likely saved thousands of lives by reducing the frequency of vulnerable fuel convoys. She submitted her dissertation with a recommendation that the inventor be formally recognized. The dissertation was approved, archived, and read by fewer than 50 people. No formal recognition followed. Harold Voss remained TAS-117, designation unknown. The system that refused to die has finally faded into obsolescence. Modern fuel injection, electronic engine management, and hybrid propulsion have made carburetor-based fuel regulation irrelevant. But for 30 years, from 1943 to 1973, the Voss modification quietly extended the reach of military vehicles across deserts, mountains, and jungles. It was copied, adapted, and re-implemented by armies that never knew its origin. It saved fuel, extended missions, and kept soldiers alive in terrain where logistics meant the difference between victory and annihilation. And the man who invented it died alone, in fire, with his name erased from every record that mattered. There is no monument to Harold Voss, no plaque at Aberdeen Proving Ground, no entry in the Army's official history of technological innovation. The testing bay where he died was demolished in 1967 to make room for a modernized vehicle research facility. The new building has no memory of what stood there before. Voss's grave is in a small cemetery in rural Pennsylvania, marked by a simple headstone that reads, Harold Voss, 1909-1943, beloved husband. There is no mention of his military service, no indication that he contributed to the war effort. His widow could not afford a larger marker, and the army did not offer to provide one. She visited the grave every Sunday for 38 years, until her own death in 1981. She was buried beside him. Their granddaughter tends the graves now, though she knows almost nothing about what her grandfather did during the war. In 2018, a group of military vehicle enthusiasts organized a project to document forgotten wartime innovations. They compiled a list of unrecognized engineers, uncredited modifications, and suppressed technical breakthroughs. Harold Voss's name appeared on that list, along with a brief description of the fuel extension system and a note that his personnel records had been lost. The project published its findings on a website that receives approximately 300 visitors per year. The M4 Sherman has become an icon of American military history. It appears in films, video games, and museum exhibits around the world. Historians praise its reliability, its versatility, and its role in defeating the Axis powers, but they rarely mention the modifications that made it effective in the field. The Voss fuel extension system, which extended its range by 250% and allowed it to operate in terrain that should have been inaccessible, is not mentioned in any major history of the Sherman tank. It exists only in declassified technical documents that gather dust in government archives. In 2021, a mechanical engineer named David Klein was researching lean burn engine technology for an electric vehicle startup. He came across a reference to Modification Order 7-43 in a declassified Army Ordnance report. Intrigued, he tracked down the original schematics and realized that the system was based on principles that are still relevant in modern hybrid engines. He published an article in an automotive engineering journal crediting Harold Voss by name and arguing that his work had been unjustly forgotten. The article was read by approximately 1,200 people. 3 of them were veterans who had operated modified Shermans during the war. One sent Klein a letter describing the April 1943 mission across the Libyan desert and thanking him for finally giving credit to the man who had made it possible. The veteran was 97 years old. He died 6 months later. In 2023, a Freedom of Information Act request was filed seeking the complete personnel file for technical specialist Harold Voss. The request was denied on the grounds that the file had been destroyed in accordance with standard record retention policies. An appeal was filed, arguing that files related to significant wartime innovations should be preserved regardless of retention schedules. The appeal was denied. The file, if it ever existed in complete form, is gone. The silence that surrounds Harold Voss is not unusual. Thousands of engineers, technicians and specialists contributed to the Allied victory in World War II without receiving public recognition. Many worked on classified projects. Many died before their work could be declassified. Many were simply forgotten because their contributions were too technical, too obscure, or too inconvenient to fit into the heroic narratives that nations prefer to tell about their wars. But Voss's case is different. His modification was not a minor improvement. It was not an incremental optimization. It fundamentally extended the operational capability of American armor at a critical moment in the war. It allowed tanks to reach objectives that had been considered unreachable. It reduced fuel consumption across an entire fleet. It saved lives, and it was copied, adapted, and re-implemented by military forces around the world for 3 decades after his death. And yet his name appears nowhere, not in histories, not in museums, not in the technical manuals that still reference Modification Order 743. He exists only as a designation. TAS 117, Inventor Unknown. There is a fuel line valve in a Paraguayan museum stamped with the code MO 743. There is a rusted Sherman in a courtyard in Asunción, its engine still carrying the ghost of a modification that should never have worked. There is a dissertation in a university archive arguing that Harold Voss deserves recognition. And there is a grave in Pennsylvania, visited by a woman who never knew what her grandfather accomplished. The war ended. The tanks kept rolling. The fuel kept flowing through lines that carried a dead man's ingenuity. And somewhere in the Libyan desert, if you listen closely to the wind across the sand, you can still hear the low, steady rumble of an engine that refused to quit, driven by a modification that no one was supposed to build and a mechanic who would not obey. The silence remains. But the engines still remember. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases. Thank you for following the story of Harold Voss. See you in the next video.